The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, this is Jennifer Palmer with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 600 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through the development of the contemplative dimensions of teaching, learning, and knowing. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. I'd like to welcome you to our December webinar, Developing Indicators for What Matters Most in Your Teaching, with David Sable, instructor in the Religious Studies Department at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We will be having a 55-minute interactive presentation, and if you'd like to stay a bit longer for questions at the end, you are welcome to do so. You can listen to the webinar through your computer's audio, through your speakers, headphones, or a headset, or you may choose the telephone option and dial in using the phone number and access code provided when you select the telephone audio option. We will be conducting an interactive practice in this webinar, during which you will be invited to write in a response to a question posed by David, and one or two people will be selected to engage in a dialogue practice. We will give further instructions just before this interactive element takes place. If at any point in the webinar you lose your connection or otherwise encounter technical difficulties, you can always leave the webinar and log back in using the link that was emailed to you. We are recording this session and will post the recording on our website soon. We will notify you by email when the recording is available. I'd now like to give you a little background about our presenter. David Sable has been teaching undergraduates at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada for 15 years. In 2012, he completed 5 years of interdisciplinary doctoral research on the impacts of using mindfulness-based contemplative practices to support critical thinking and learning in the classroom. David has led numerous faculty development workshops on contemplative pedagogy, and in July 2014, he co-led the first residential graduate-level practicum in Canada on contemplative education for K-12. He is currently working on a book exploring the impacts and implications of using contemplative practices in the education system to support a more mindful society. I'd now like to welcome David Sable.
Hello everyone. This session is going to be a little unusual, as Jen was saying, because it's going to be mostly interactive. But what I'd like to begin with is just a brief review of the research that led up to this presentation, and then we'll apply these practices to a central question, and then use reflective inquiry to help you develop indicators for what matters most. There are two parts to the contemplative practices that I introduced to the undergraduates in my courses. The first part was individual, and it follows the general paradigm that contemplation is introspective. It consists of mindfulness meditation, the same kind of mindfulness meditation that we might practice at a Contemplative Mind seminar, and then a guided contemplation. You'll experience this in a few minutes, as well as reflective writing. The second part of this is interactive. It involves listening in pairs in a very particular way that applies the principles of mindfulness to listening, and then again applies the principles of mindfulness to reflective inquiry in pairs. And it's from there that an open dialogue is encouraged, first in pairs and then in the whole classroom. So what we're going to be able to do is we are going to look at this from the point of view of how it's going to help us answer a central question. But continuing on a little bit, do we know that applying mindfulness this way works? Well, what students report is what you see here. They reported that it certainly helped them settle their minds, slow down. It helped them focus openly on what was going on in the present, relax habitual ways of thinking, and feel more self-confident, particularly in terms of finding their own voice, recognizing that they had their own thoughts about the questions in the courses, and that they their own voice mattered. Sometimes we find students who don't think there's anything more important than just reiterating what's been said in class by the instructor. And so this last bullet was particularly important for many people. In the formal research, I used mixed methods research. So I was engaging first in qualitative research and then in quantitative. And the qualitative results showed that indeed students do find their own voice. They inquire about the other partners' perspectives. And the unexpected part of the research was this was not part of an initial hypothesis. This was actually in the qualitative part of the research where I was simply trying to form a theory of what happens when we use contemplative practices. And that was that a sense of connectedness developed. And that sense of connectedness was stronger between students who disagreed with each other. And that has huge implications when we think about the polarization that exists in the larger society. So what I'd like to do is just, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, and you can read more quotes from the students in my article in first edition of the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. But here's two of them. I'm finding it hard to find words that describe the feeling of hearing other people's perspectives and learning. Maybe connection is a good one. I find, in a weird way, even though you'd think that it's a disconnect because we're all so different, it's almost a connection to people. Another person wrote, I've never developed any really good friendships through these interactive exercises, but I definitely feel like they make you feel like you're connected to people. You just get a sense of your connection to that student and then to all the other students in the class. I think it's changed my general view of how I connect with people, even outside the class. It's hard to explain. I don't really know any better word to use than connectedness, because that's really what it is. And so from the qualitative research, I went on to do quantitative research. And in that part, we actually found statistically significant gains. Students, hold on one second here. Students actually showed evidence in their writing. It affected their dispositions for critical thinking, which included flexibility in considering alternatives and opinions, honesty in facing one's own biases, prejudices, stereotypes, and egocentric or sociocentric tendencies, and a willingness to reconsider and revise views where honest reflection suggests that change is warranted. So those kinds of research results were very encouraging. And I have found since that time, working with faculty, that this same method, if you want to call it that, this same process is useful when we're doing curriculum design, when we're making decisions about how and what we're going to teach. So I'm going to now ask you to save any questions you have. You can make a note of that, and we'll try to save some time at the end. And we're going to actually go through the exercise. To begin with, we start with mindfulness meditation. So I'm going to ask you, wherever you are, to please sit up straight, I'm assuming you're in a chair. If you're on a cushion, that's great. And with a good posture, so that your breathing is not hindered, so your breathing is natural. Your arms and your legs relaxed, feet flat on the floor. You can bring your attention to your breath, to the whole breathing process. And as you do this, you begin to recognize there are all kinds of sensations in your body. You can begin to feel where there may be some tension, where there may be some sense of well-being, or perhaps some sense of worry about past or the future, whatever it is, just open with that. Just be there with that. And let your attention return to the natural breathing. In the same way, thoughts will come up. And the objective is not to try to make your mind blank. It's not to try to get to any particular state at all. It's to be open and present without getting caught up in judging. Whatever your experience is, it just is. And as you return to that present moment, by returning to the breath, you actually begin the practice of meditation. So your eyes can be open. We're not trying to shut off from the world. I wouldn't stare at a particular point, maybe look away from the screen. Your eye gaze can be relaxed. Whatever sounds there may be in the environment, just let that be. Notice it and return to your breathing. And you can have a sense of the firmness in your back, a sense of the strength in your spine, and a sense of openness and softness in your heart, in the front of your chest. And in this practice of mindfulness, we're combining both that sense of discipline and strength that's there in an upright posture with a sense of openness and softness in our front and in our whole being. And we're going to share a few minutes of silence just to let our minds settle, and then we'll go on to the guided contemplation. And I'm going to time this on my end. So we'll begin now. And now, transfer your attention to the breathing, to the words of this question. What matters most to you in using contemplative practices in your courses? And if you're not sure if you're using contemplative practices in your courses, what would matter most to you in using contemplative practices in your courses? And here's the first step. Hold the question. Don't search for an answer yet. You may notice that there's a strong habitual tendency to come up with an answer right away, to start thinking analytically. So for another moment, just read the question over several times, or Just hold the question in your mind's eye. Let that be the focus and the anchor to the present moment. We're still continuing the mindfulness practice, but now the object of the meditation, rather than the breath, is just this question. What matters most to you in using contemplative practices in your courses? Notice the challenge of just trying to stay with the words of the question. And now step 2. Find the underlying felt sense. Let your awareness deepen and pay attention now to what's going on in your body. There are different ways of knowing. And here, we're complementing what we may know conceptually with what we know at the level of a felt sense. And this is not just simply what you're feeling emotionally. It's something that's as yet unarticulated. It's in the realm of intuition, and it's usually underneath what we're thinking, but we don't always pay direct attention to it. It's kind of motivating our thoughts. So let your awareness deepen and open up. So you've transferred your attention not just to the words of the question, but now opened your attention to include what's going on, allowing some openness, not searching too much. And we'll give that just another moment. And now step 3. Find the fresh language that integrates the felt sense with your conceptual response to the question. So here we're beginning to integrate and develop insight into the question in a new way. And as you find this fresh language, please begin to write it down. Now you can write that on a piece of paper or in the question window, and Jen is going to explain what to do when you get to this part.
Thank you, David. So if you're interested in participating on the air in a dialogue practice with David, we ask that you please type your response to David's question into the question section of your GoToMeeting control panel, which has probably docked itself onto the right-hand side of your webinar screen. Your responses are only viewable to me. And from these responses, we will select one or two people to engage in the practice. And please make sure that you're using a headset with a microphone, or if you're using a phone, make sure that you've entered the audio control pin provided in your GoToWebinar control panel. If you'd prefer not to be selected for this practice, then we invite you to write your responses on a piece of paper or somewhere else on your computer. So if you write your response in to the question section and send it to us, then that is our signal that you would be interested in being selected to be on the air to engage in the dialogue practice.
So we're going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to actually write out the fresh language that comes when you integrate that sense, the underlying felt sense, with your conceptual response to the question. Okay, so just another moment. So if you're interested in participating, and we'll model the process together, then just post what you have up to this point so that Jen can see it. I can't see it. We're going to do this by audio.
All right, so I'm getting a lot of responses, so thank you everyone for providing your thoughts and your responses to the question. And I see that Teresa Southam has written in a response. So Teresa, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you are on a computer that has a mic, you will be able to speak with us. So Teresa, are you with us?
I am, yes.
Oh, great. Great. Wonderful. Well, would you be interested in engaging in the practice with David?
I would.
Wonderful. Thank you. And where are you calling in from, Teresa?
I'm calling in from Nelson, British Columbia.
Thank you. All right. Well, David,
Okay.
would you like to begin?
Great. Sure. That's great, Teresa. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is just to read whatever it is that you wrote. I can't see it. And part of the discipline is to just stick with what it is that you wrote. You might have a tendency, like a lot of us, to try to elaborate once we read what we write. But just read to me what you have, and then I'll use the act of listening to try to reflect back what you say, and that'll be the first part. Okay, go ahead.
So what matters most to me in using contemplative practices in educational settings is that teachers and learners get a chance to start from what's really happening now and then plan where they could go based on what feels healthy and balanced, as opposed to simply where they could go, for example, with no attention to balance or respect for all living things, etc.
Okay, so what you wrote was that if students have a sense of what is really happening now, then they have a sense of balance with all living things, and that will make the contemplative practice useful. Now, help me by filling in what I missed or correcting me if I'm wrong.
When you asked us to do the part of the exercise where we had the felt experience behind the why, I identified with a feeling of unease about so many of the things that are happening in the world today. And I believe that that unease is present in a lot of our educational institutions with both the teachers and the learners and the staff. And so it sits out there and is just there. So with the contemplative practice, my sense is, my own sense when I was doing it with you, is that there's time to actually acknowledge that those things are on my mind. And just to be more concrete, I'm thinking about things like increased difference between the rich and the poor, poverty, climate change, these kinds of worries. And so I'm just thinking that contemplative practice gives us the space to acknowledge, not to be overwhelmed by, but to acknowledge that these things are on our minds.
Okay, so that's where the sense of balance comes in?
And I think so.
Okay, so when you, what kind of contemplative practice do you use with students?
I'm using it more in an administrative sense because I help teachers teach. So we usually use in our meetings just starting with silence, and we do use some active listening in our meetings as well.
Right, very good. Okay, so following the rules, the active listening, I'm simply trying to say back what it is that you said, and then I'm assuming now that you feel that I got the gist, I got the main point of what you were trying to say, and so I'll continue with inquiry about what you've said if you feel that I actually heard you properly.
Yeah, it seems like you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Okay. So to continue with the reflective inquiry, how would you know if you're achieving that kind of balance and reflective perspective that you're trying to encourage? How would you know if it's actually happening?
Thinking that in our own meetings, in my own meetings with teachers, you can have a meeting that has a sense of very quick knee-jerk responses, and you can have one where you feel like people are really taking time to consider. And I'm thinking that part of what you would know is that people were slowing down and taking time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you would probably hear it in their more fulsome descriptions and responses, so that they weren't so clipped and brief, that you might get more fulsome responses to the topic matters.
Uh-huh. Right. And so here what we're talking about is the indicators would be in real time. This is an observation you're making, actually watching and listening to what they're saying and how they're interacting with you and each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is an important way for people to develop indicators, and a lot of it has to do with observation. And in this case, you're observing whether or not they're slowing down, whether or not they're giving time to each other and to their own thoughts. And that indicates to you a broader perspective, the balanced perspectives that you want the faculty or the students to have. So this is the beginning of working with indicators, and here what we would see is, okay, you would be making notes after the class as to whether or not you felt that you had effectively accomplished what you thought was most important, and you could begin then to look at those notes over time. So after 2 or 3 weeks, you could see if the contemplative practice that you used was effective. So what I'd like to do now is just turn the tables here. And I've prepared more than one response to this question. And I'm going to ask you to do what I just did. I'm going to ask you to listen to what I read, and then to do reflective inquiry with me, not referring so much to what you wrote yet, but just doing the inquiry in an open-ended way to help me look more deeply at what I've said. Does that sound clear?
It does.
Okay. So what matters most to me is whether or not a student can reflect in the sense of becoming more aware of one's own intellectual habits and how they form. And I'm concerned with whether or not the students learn to inquire in the sense of open-minded curiosity with each other. And finally, do they generate contextual understanding, both individually and in dialogue and collaboration? So now you would reflect back what I said.
All right, so it sounds like you're very interested in how a student interacts with other students, and you're wondering what you hope for them is that they can have the chance to have open-minded curiosity and have a broader understanding of their peers, including their context. And you're also interested in the students having a chance to reflect on what I've heard Daniel refer to as their interiority, or their own intellectual habits. So you're interested in that part of it. I was a little unclear on the contextual understanding. I wasn't sure whether you were interested in the contextual, the student understanding the context of other students, or the broader environmental context.
Okay, so that's really excellent. Thank you. I think you really heard, you got all the points that I had there. And in terms of the beginning of your inquiry, contextual understanding, I think the context that I'm referring to there is whether or not they understand how their partner got to what it is that they said. What was the story? what was the narrative that led their partner to answer the contemplation question the way that they did. Invariably, there are differences, and if they begin to appreciate the context in which that answer, that response came, they start to know it and understand it in a different way. So I'm particularly interested there in that context, but it could very well be that the context for one or more of the students is the larger issues of our relationship to the environment and the world around us. That certainly could be one context that some of the students have for their response to many of the questions that I use.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Do you have any other questions about what I said?
No, I just find that very interesting.
Good. So just taking off my hat now as a partner, coming back to observe what we just went through, what we were doing was taking the basic principles of mindfulness, being able to focus our attention on what was said, and then opening and relaxing so that we could actually give back to the person what we heard. And in so doing, we're doing more than trying to put words in their mouth. We're not trying to win an argument. Essentially what we're trying to do is to be curious, trying to find out how the other person got to what they were saying, and then if we had a little more time, both Therese and I could now try to answer this question together. We could actually say, okay, given what you said and given what I said, how would we answer this jointly? How would we approach this? There's an obvious way forward for us because we could take into account environmental concerns and what's going on in the world around us in addition to our personal perspectives with respect to the question that was asked. So that's what we mean here by a dialogue. It's a flow of meaning between people. Okay, thank you, Teresa. So, Jen, I'm going to ask you if we could do one more round.
Certainly, yeah. So I'm going to select another person from our list here. Let's see, Kimberly Redding. I'm going to unmute you, Kimberly. Kimberly, can you join us?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, Kimberly.
Hello.
Hi, thank you. Where are you calling in from?
Waukesha, Wisconsin,
Wonderful.
outside Milwaukee.
Wonderful, thank you.
It's good to be here.
Yep, thank you for joining us.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so Kimberly, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing in principle. Just read to me what it is that you wrote, and I'm going to try to reflect it back so that I actually give voice to what it is that you said.
Okay. My felt sense is that it matters because it keeps us, me, alive. Quite literally because contemplation has been key to my own mental, spiritual, and emotional health. But I don't know how to say that in a way that makes sense to a student who is on campus to learn XYZ so they can get a job. I can't say that contemplative practice will earn them an A or even help them master course content.
Okay, so your felt sense is that this actually helps keep you alive, contemplation practice. And there's a challenge that you're not exactly sure how to convey that or tell students, give them that same sense of value that you place on contemplative practice, and how would that translate into helping them get a job? Okay, did I miss anything?
No, I think you pretty much got it. I guess another way to say it maybe is I've seen how contemplative practice has helped me kind of problem solve in my own life and get through really difficult situations.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a clearer way to say it. But the challenge is that immediate application. I mean, I can just hear students saying, you know, I'm not at college to learn how to deal with problems. I'm here to get a degree or to get a job. Yeah.
Right, good, yes. Well, I can more than sympathize, I can empathize. It's not that much different in Canada. So let me ask you, assuming now that I have pretty well been able to reflect back what you said,
Mm-hmm.
are there situations that have happened for you where you do think that the students or a student actually began to value contemplative practice?
Yes.
Okay, so
Absolutely. Yeah.
okay, so in the situation where that has occurred, how did you know it was happening?
Because in their written work, whether it was an informal journal or a more structured kind of reflective essay, they could identify how they used to think about something and how they think about it now. Or they could identify, yeah, I think that's pretty much, they could identify the change in themselves.
Aha, okay, so one indicator here is if the student has that kind of metacognitive ability to see the difference, to see the transformation in their own thinking.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
So there we go. So that becomes an indicator. And now the next question, if we wanted to pursue it, would be, okay, well, how does that become measurable? How would we, that could be just a yes or no type of thing. Do we want to just say, well, either they do or they don't, or do we want to make finer gradations here? Do we want to ask the student to make further discriminations? Or do we make further discriminations?
Right. That would be hard to break it down.
Right, and actually, when just to reflect back for a moment here on the research that I went through, you can actually just use it as you could say, it's either yes or no. Either you can tell that they're doing it or they're not. And then keeping track of that over a period of time, say several weeks, you may notice that they can do this more frequently, or you may notice that they can do this with more depth, and that adds to the way in which you evaluate or assess what it is they're doing. And over time, you can say that then that becomes measurable. You can see the number of instances, for example, in their written work where they were calling attention to a shift in their thinking. If you see that happening at week 2 and at week 3, and then you see it happening even more as they go along, then you may be able to discriminate even more instead of just, well, am I looking for qualities here in the thinking, or is it simply just that they're able to observe a change taking place? And that would take you deeper into your term,
Right.
But it might allow you, working with the students over time, to develop more precise indicators.
Right.
So we have a second example. Now, would you dare to reverse the process with me here?
I'll give it a try.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I confess I had prepared some responses in advance, and actually this particular response that I wrote to what matters most, very relevant here to what you said, and this, you were not a shill in the audience. I didn't know you were going to ask and do what you did here. So what matters most over time, I want to know if the student's writing demonstrates their ability to explore an underlying or previously unnoticed felt sense or feeling or intuition. I want to know if the students are open to new categories and perspectives. I want to know if they can integrate intellectual knowledge with personal experience and reflection.
So what I think I heard you say was that what matters most is that that you're able to tell through looking at their writing that they can sort of develop new categories of thinking about things, new perspectives, and that they can integrate the intuitive, what they know intuitively, with what they know cognitively.
Yep.
Is that?
Yeah,
Does that capture it?
Sure. I mean, I would also add that I was interested if they began to explore the underlying felt sense, or something that they hadn't noticed before at the level of feeling or intuition. So how could you help me go deeper with understanding this? What questions do you have about what you just heard?
I'd be curious to know if you've been able to explain to students, or if you could explain to us a little bit more, that the idea of a felt sense. And how that differs from this is what I think.
Right. Great question. Really good. Well, most of what happens in the university is aimed at cultivating what we think. Most universities, it's not very controversial, like to explain in their mission statement that what we add is critical thinking. That's what we do with our students. And so it's not just about giving them the information they need to get a job, it's teaching them how to be critical thinkers. And yet none of that directly addresses the underlying affective, not cognitive, but affective part of their being. And so when I talk about felt sense, I do actually, with the students, emphasize that it's a way of knowing that's taking place at the heart level. It's a way of knowing that's taking place underneath the words. And it happens sometimes very quickly, and we don't pay attention to it. We immediately get caught up in the thinking part. For some people, it's easier than others to understand what's meant by a felt sense. For some people, it's better to just refer to this as their intuition. It's a sense that they have, although they're not sure why they think something. And sometimes people can actually find this literally it's a sensation in their body. It's actually a place where they can feel something, like when Teresa was talking about that sense of concern and anxiety about the environment. Or it may be something more personal. But it's not necessary to get the students to go through a lot of disclosure. They don't have to provide a lot of detail, but they can report that I feel some unease, some worry, or I have a sense of well-being and cheerfulness about this. I'm optimistic. And when they're in that mode, it's easier for many students because they never thought that that would matter in a classroom. And here somebody's saying, no, it does matter, because it's going to be underneath any really personal, intelligent answer to this question. Your felt sense is going to be what matters most to you underneath. And it's going to shape the reasoning that you use when you go through a conceptual explanation. You actually can read a little bit about this, and anyone who's interested. In the article that I wrote for the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry, I discussed this a little bit, and there's more in my thesis about this reflexive awareness. In the literature, for decades, people who have been studying critical thinking have noticed that there's an affective component, a disposition and a willingness to be curious, to listen to other perspectives. And it stems from what I'm calling here the felt sense. This comes from a tradition called focusing, and it was initiated by Eugene Gendlin at the University of Chicago. And there's a lot of literature on it. There's a website, and I was trained in focusing myself and mixed it with this mindfulness practice. And I do find that the majority of students get it. They may not feel that they got it precisely, but they appreciate the meaningfulness of looking at their own experience. So thank you for asking me to elaborate on that.
That's very helpful. That notion that the felt sense is what's underneath that gives shape to, or that kind of is the foundation for the reasoning with which you answer the question. And then it becomes obvious, well, of course that's going to shape how you would answer a question if you're worried about it or delighted to be asked it. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Great. Thank you, Kimberly, for participating. Now, I want to make some general comments about what we just went through, and I want to applaud the courage of both Teresa and Kimberly for getting into the fishbowl here and letting everybody watch this. Now, for most students, this experience in a fishbowl would be pretty challenging because essentially they have to be able to remember what someone else said, and they have to ask questions they're not prepared to ask. So what makes a difference is that if you pair students up and they're just working peer-to-peer, they're not in a fishbowl, they're not dealing with the power dynamic of talking to the instructor in the front of the room, they're just dealing with one person. And over several weeks of doing this, they get comfortable enough with the practice that they're willing to take the little bit of risk, you could say the vulnerability, to actually try out what they are learning from the mindfulness practice in their ability to listen, to acknowledge, gee, it's hard to listen. Sometimes I can't remember what the other people said. Sometimes I only get a tiny little bit of it. And they also accept the challenge of being able to ask questions. That's more difficult. Even more difficult than listening and being able to reflect back what you've heard is asking a really helpful question. A lot of students find that questions are intimidating, and so they don't even want to put their partner into that situation of being asked a question. But after a few weeks, they realize, oh, this is supposed to be helpful. And it really does make me think more deeply about what I've written. And the way it works is exactly as Kimberly was saying. You notice there's a pause, and they each notice that the other person took some time to think. And they develop respect for one another. That respect becomes a kind of trust that people are going to do this together in this course. Thus, you get that result that I got where they start to feel connected. And they start to feel connected not just because they agreed with each other. That's almost immaterial. They might get to a point of consensus. They might get to a dialogue where they both come up with a joint meaning that they can agree on. But more important is they understood where the other person was coming from and why they thought the way that they did, why they think the way that they do about some issue, whether it's jobs or the environment or whatever it might be. So the peer-to-peer work is a way to overcome that power dynamic in the classroom that makes a lot of students shy or puts the extroverted student out in front all the time, kind of taking up all the space. So what I'd like to do now is just open it up here. We have about 5 minutes or so, and if there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question, you can use either the chat window so that Jen can see your question, or you can see if Jen will put you on the microphone.
Thank you, David. Yeah, if you'd like to write in a question, you can do it in that question pane. And what I'll do is I'll select some questions and read them aloud to David so that those of you who don't have a microphone or haven't phoned in using a telephone can also participate. And afterward, we will have this list of questions. And I think, David, you said you were open to maybe getting back to some people who had burning questions, so we can do that afterward. But just for now, I'm going to give you a minute to type in questions, and then I'll read a few aloud. All right, it looks like we have a question from Ken Syke. And this is actually a question that comes up fairly often during our programs. And David, if you think you're able to answer this question, go right ahead. What happens when students resist or feel resistance to participating in contemplative practices in the classroom?
Mm-hmm. It would help to know what contemplative practices Ken is referring to. I can try to answer it generically.
Sure. It looks like he mentioned the reflective inquiry practice.
Yeah. I think that when that has happened for me, I try to put students at ease, and I say, if you're not comfortable doing this, then you don't have to. You can simply have a discussion with your partner, or you don't have to come up with questions. And what I do is I get them to change partners each week. So what happens over time, and it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks, is that they encounter someone else who was comfortable and was able to do this in such a way that they realized they could take that little bit of a risk. What can I say? There's a major difference between asking the student to do this with you as an instructor and just asking them to do this with a partner or someone that they may even know, and to do this just sort of privately to test it out. So it's not that common that I run into that resistance. I usually have 35 or 40 students in a course, and I would say there's the first week there might be a third of them who have that resistance. By the third week there might be 10% who have that kind of resistance, and eventually they see that it opens up and relaxes everybody in the class. So coming at this kind of non-challenging, gradual way of introducing reflective inquiry has been reasonably successful.
Thank you, David. Looks like we have another question from Judy Halebsky, and that is, do you use this technique along with a series of readings or based on discussions of controversial issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. The courses that I teach, one of them is Buddhism, which is kind of ready-made for this kind of thing because there are lots of deep questions that come up, and the readings go along with it. But the other course is more interesting in a way. It's called Spirituality and Work, and we get into particular frameworks for how we might judge whether or not people in a company are being able to practice their spiritual values and their beliefs and so forth. And so lots of controversy comes up. And what we try to do with the controversy is to put it into some kind of context or framework. For example, corporate social responsibility. When we look at whether a company is genuinely concerned with the impact they're having on the surrounding communities, for example, environmentally, or whether or not the company is using this simply as a point of publicity and they're acting contrary to what their mission statement says, that becomes a very interesting discussion. Students then go and do some research on this and try to uncover whether this is authentic or not. So the answer is we get into fairly controversial issues, and sometimes I am actually a little concerned because it can become, what could I say, it could become kind of a hot issue. And yet I have been impressed with the way students will avoid just aggressive challenges or blanket judgments. You create an atmosphere, not just from the sitting practice, but from applying the mindfulness to listening and inquiry. And it opens the door to conversations that many of them wouldn't be able to have otherwise.
Great. Thank you for giving us some more insight into that, David. I think we have time for just one last question, and that is from Sue Lyle. How do you prepare yourself to engage in this respectful way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as many of the people who lead these seminars often say, it's good to have a strong practice. And so I do practice mindfulness meditation. I have been practicing for many years. And I also tried to lead a balanced lifestyle, meaning that on the day that I teach, I try to make sure that I get some exercise before going to class and that I'm in good shape, both mentally and physically. It basically gives me the confidence to be really curious about the students. Whatever you can do to make yourself curious about them in a friendly way, that's what I would do. I mean, there's preparing yourself so that you're not just hung up with your own confusions, doubts, frustrations, and speed. And that's kind of the obvious answer. But I think the more interesting is what enables you to be really curious about these students and what their stories are. Anything that leads you to that curiosity will help. Wonderful.
Well, David, were there any other last comments that you'd like to make during the webinar?
I would just say that people who do want to write to me, or if, I don't know if Jen, you'll be able to help with this, but
sure.
I am willing to carry on this conversation. Of course, it might not be tonight or tomorrow. It might take a while for me to get back to you, but I'm happy to respond. And I also want to encourage people to use the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education discussion board. I've been lurking there, and I have yet to get on there and contribute, but I'm about to. There's several that I want to respond to. And that would engage even more people who are tracking those conversations online. I think that's a wonderful resource that's been put up.
Well, thank you, David, for extending that invitation, and thanks also for providing us with the opportunity to experience some of the work that you've been doing in your classroom, and for also bringing in some of our audience members to actually take part in a practice. Just to remind everyone, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the website soon if you'd like to share it with colleagues. If you'd like to view past webinars or learn more about the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society and the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, or ACMHE, please visit our website at contemplativemind.org. Thank you for listening.